Hi everybody, welcome back to Angie's Answers. I wanted to come to you today. I am at my home. This is my sewing room at my house, and I wanted to show you how I finish the binding on my domestic machine. So if you go back in our videos, you're going to see a video on how we put the binding on the quilt on the long arm on the front side, or using that flip zipper, we can flip the project over and put the binding on the long arm on the back side of the quilt. So then once that binding is on the one side of the quilt, then we of course take and trim off all of that extra batting and backing, and we usually leave about a scant 1/4 inch. Then to finish the binding, most people of course wrap it around and do hand stitching on the back. I absolutely hate hand stitching. So I'm going to show you a couple quick tips on how I like to finish my binding on my domestic machine. It's one of the fastest ways for me to bind quilts, and it's one of my favorite things to do. So I am going to zoom in a little bit closer and show you how I pin, and then also how I start sewing on my domestic machine too. So I hope you enjoy this video on finishing the binding on both sides using a machine. Okay, I was trying to get you guys a good eagle-eyed view to be able to see the quilt project and my pins. So as you can see, I've got some pins already attached in here. What I do is I take a straight pin and I place it directly into that ditch on the front side of the quilt. And then if you flip it around, you're able to see how much of the binding is going to be caught when you're sewing directly in that ditch. So it's really important that every pin that you put in, you just rotate that around so you can see exactly where that pin is. The more consistent with how much fabric you have over here, the better it's going to look when you're sewing it. So let me pull this out of the way just a little bit so you can see we do leave a little bit extra of the batting and the backing, about a scant 1/4 inch away from where our stitching line was. So we originally had stitched this part of the binding on the front side of the quilt on our long arm. I took all my pins off and then I trimmed so I could have a little bit extra of that batting and backing, just a scant 1/4 inch. Then I can wrap that binding around here, hold that in place, and use my straight pins. These are the quilting pins from Handi Quilter. So I look at where my last pin point was and I push that through the ditch right there and pop that back up right in the ditch on the other side. Then if I flip it over, you can see I caught way too much of that binding fabric. So this is where it's important that you take the time and you manipulate that fabric so you're catching the same amount all the way across. So there's still just a little bit too much there. If you look at where this pin is, it's a lot closer to the edge. So sometimes you have to play with it. So I just take my finger back here and I'm pulling that binding out so it's not catching as much, but I'm still pinning directly in that ditch. Then if I flip it over, that's much closer. So then I would move down, move to my next spot. I look where that pin's coming out and go just past it. Push this pin through the ditch there, come right back up through that ditch, flip it over. I caught too much. So it's a kind of, you have to play with it. You have to get comfortable with it. It does take some time to pin, but once you get that pinning down, once you're comfortable with where that is, then it does go a lot faster. So I just make sure that I'm pinned in the ditch and I make sure I'm catching some fabric back here, but not too much of it. Then I'm gonna come and just keep pinning all the way around the quilt in that ditch there. That looks great. Then I'll move on to the next one. Pin in that ditch there, push that right through. It's a little bit too much on this side, so I can fix that. I'll just slide that back out towards the edge, and that's much better, much more consistent. So you really want to take your time when you're doing this pinning. One pin at a time and flip it over, and the more consistent you are with how much fabric is back here, the better it's going to be when you're doing your stitching. So we do our stitching. When I'm stitching, I like to have my quilt top facing up, and I am going to stitch right here in this ditch and pull these pins out as I'm doing that. So let me reposition the camera so you can see that a little bit better. All right. I have my quilt here. Like I said, the quilt top is facing up like this. To make sure that I get exactly where I want to start, I do take my hand wheel and just rotate my needle to make sure it's going to go down exactly where I want it to, and then reach behind and put my presser foot down. And then I'm going to take just a couple of stitches, hold my reverse button, just to make sure that those are nice and tacked. So I did already take out that first pin right there, so I don't hit that one. Then it's important too, you can't quite see that I have some extra slack in the fabric here. So I lift up on that so it's not pulling really hard through. So I make sure that the quilt is nice and loose like this. Then I am going to just hold tight here and start stitching down right in that ditch. As soon as I get to a pin, I'll pull that pin out. This is one of our favorite ways to use that Zirkle magnetic pin dish, so I can just toss those pins over there. And then I stitch in the ditch all the way around this whole quilt. So our first step was putting the binding on the long arm on the front side for this project. Then I trimmed everything. Then I took my time with the pinning. I can't stress that enough. It is so important that you take your time when you're doing that pinning, because the more consistent you are with the pinning, the better you're going to catch that fabric around the backside. So let me stop there and just take a quick little break and pull this around so you guys can see what it looks like on part that I've already sewn. So here is my stitch line right here, stitching that, and it creates that little flange, but that's on the backing. So I've got this flange on my backing here. So always make sure, of course, that you blend your threads. That's going to help hide if it's not exactly perfect. And then when I do my corners, I kind of double stitch. So I came in and I stitched a little bit past to secure that. And then I had my needle here in the corner and I stitched back and forth that way. So that'll just help hold that corner a little bit better. And it's not super obvious on the front that I did that extra stitching because I blended my thread. But as you can see from the front side, I'm stitching right in that ditch as close as I can, and it's not as noticeable on this front side. So the front of the quilt, the binding looks finished great. And then when it's wrapped around the back, all you get is that little flange. We definitely don't recommend this if you're going to enter a quilt in a quilt show. That's one of the first things that the judges do, is they feel your binding to make sure that it feels nice and full, and then they look at how it was attached. So unfortunately, quilt show judges prefer your binding to be hand stitched, but for me, I don't like hand stitching. So this is how I finish all of my bindings. I pin in the ditch there, and then I stitch with my domestic machine to completely close it up. If you watched our video on how we attach the binding on the long arm on the front side, you'll see how I joined those two pieces together. I did take the time to hand sew where those two pieces were, that folded miter was, where I folded that miter and then connected those together. So I did just whip stitch and hand sew that. So that is the only hand stitching that I do on a quilt, is where those two pieces of binding are coming together. So I just finished stitching here in the ditch all the way around the quilt. But before I do anything else, I do want to check to make sure that I caught everything on the back side. So I do take and flip it over, and I stick a pin right here in the backing fabric. This helps me know where I started checking. So I'm going to start checking here and go all the way around the quilt and make sure that I caught that binding fabric and that I have this flange on this back side of the quilt. So keep in mind, if you did it the other way, and like on the other video that we have, if you start on the long arm and apply the binding to the backing first and wrap it to the front, then your flange would be on the front side of the quilt. So you can do it either way, total personal preference. But it's just a good tip. If you stick a pin right here, that way you'll know where you started checking. This is a big king size quilt, so I wouldn't want to keep checking around and around the entire project. So I'm going to start right here, and I just move the quilt over, and I check to make sure that I caught enough binding. You can see that I'm not perfectly consistent with my flange. This is a little bit too big, where this is a little bit closer. So I'm not perfectly consistent, but I'm really close. I'm happy with this. This is just a quilt for me. And even if I was giving this quilt to my friend, I would be happy with this result. If there was a spot where I did miss and I didn't quite catch any of that binding fabric and it was open, then I would take and I would put a pin wherever I had missed it. So I would try to repin that back down. Then I would take that section on my machine and just restitch right over that again. You can do it from the front if you want, or you could do it from the back. The risk that you take if you restitch it from the back is that your stitching will end up over here in the border and you would definitely see that navy thread, because I have navy binding in that contrast. So for me, I prefer to always stitch here from the front because I can see where I'm stitching on the front and that looks better. I don't mind if there's some extra stitching on the back. So I would just continue to go around and check my entire project and make sure that I caught that binding all the way around the edge of the quilt. And then I would also check my corners and make sure my corners look good, and just keep going all the way around the entire project. I'll come back and give you a big view of what the entire quilt looks like now that this is done. And here it is, the finished project. Binding all the way around on both sides. I want to thank you all again so much for watching. If you have any questions on how we did this whole process, you can email us at quiltingconnectionwi@yahoo.com. Check out our website, which is longarmconnection.com. And again, if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer, you can comment below or send us an email with those. So I hope you all have a great day, and thanks for watching Angie's Answers. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow.